I thought I'd start this morning's talk by reading to you that little piece of writing that I said was on the desk in that office in Nagpur, India. It's from Starr Daily's Wellsprings of Immortality. This is the day to walk softly and speak softly, turning away wrath with gentleness. Deep within us is a place of absolute calm, of unmodified silence, unqualified peace. At the center of every storm is absolute peace. Deep in the ocean is this place of peace, which no typhoon can disturb, which can be reached by no raging storms on the surface, and which remains unaltered through all the turmoils of nature. So it is with us. In our deepest heart is a place where absolute peace holds sway. This is the peace of Christ, not of the world. And nothing the world can do will enter in to disturb this calm. And that was the piece of writing that enables this young lady to keep going when things are tough. I'm going to read on from Elijah this morning, the first book of Kings, chapter 19, beginning at verse 9 now. And there Elijah came to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left." And it's significant to meditate upon that because that was probably one of Elijah's problems. The I, thinking it was all on his, up to him. "And they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. Just as I was going after the counseling meeting this morning to my room, I was stopped at the bottom of the stairs by our friend Dagmar, if that's the correct pronunciation of her name, dear elderly friend who wanted to tell me a story of how God spoke to her. And she finished up by saying, "And it was the still, small voice." I didn't think that was any coincidence. You remember I was talking to you about books. Again, I'm going to refer to one book. When I was in Kentucky for the second time, you okay? No problems? Oh, I see. Thank you very much. Bless you. Thanks a lot. Bless you, Bill. Thank you very much. Do appreciate that. Down in Kentucky, I went for the second time. Last year I was down there. And Before going to a camp, I was in a little village or an American town, which I love to be in. And I was asked to talk with a young minister who was having a few difficulties. And so we went out to a lovely little lake and sat quietly throughout the afternoon just sharing there. At the end he said, perhaps you'd like to see my church, Bert. And I said, well, I'd love to. And I thought it was only a little church. But of course I'd forgotten that most of your churches really are great big churches. And he took me to his church, which was a massive one, and it has an average congregation of 400, I think, in the mornings. And I was very impressed. And then after we looked around the church, he went into his study and went into his book room and brought out a book. And he said, I believe God wants you to have this book. And the book is called Celebration of Discipline by Richard J. Foster. So remembering all the other things God had done to me, I'm always alert, and I took it. I said, well, thank you very much. The Lord has been speaking to me about discipline. So I believe it's from him. Well, I went to the Kentucky camp, and I was meeting the people coming in and doing as I like to do. I like to help them, those that can't carry their bags, because I think this is a beautiful way of expressing love. I think it's a lovely way of meeting people and getting to know them even before the camp starts. And it's a lovely way of in a sense, just welcoming them to the camp. And so one of the young pastors came in who had been there the previous time I was at Kentucky, and we shared welcomes. And then I said, how are you getting on? And he said, well, I know you'd like to hear this, Bert, he said, but I've been being blessed by learning how to meditate and be still. Oh, I said, that's good. He said, yes, he said, I found a book which has been so helpful to me. And I said, what book is that? And he said, Celebration of Discipline by Richard J. Foster. Oh, that's wonderful, I said, I just received it myself. Well, we went down to the meditation on the first morning, and would you believe it? The gentleman who was giving the meditation stood up, and the very first words he said was this, that we're going to have some silence this week in meditation. I have been reading a good book. And the book was called Celebration of Discipline by Richard J. Foster. By this time, my ears were waggling and my heart was ringing. But this is the interesting thing. When I got home, I packed the book. When I got home, I put my book on my bookshelf, and I thought, well, I will read that book. But as I was going through my mail and going through the pigeonholes in my bureau, I took out an envelope, and as I took the envelope out, a little piece of paper fell out. And on this paper was written, Celebration of Discipline by Richard J. Foster. And I thought to myself, where did that come from? I thought I'd never heard of that title before. I thought, how could this come from? I didn't bring it from America. It had come out of the pigeonhole where my envelopes were. And I couldn't think how that had got into that bureau. And then it was 2 or 3 days later, I remembered that some 6 months previously, I'd gone to talk to a school of children of all nationalities. And then afterwards, I'd gone up to be with the headmistress and share with her. And she was talking to a minister. And this minister says, I think, Mr. Kerley, you would like to read this book. And he wrote down the name, Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. And when I went home, I put it in my bureau and left it there. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? That was just a small introduction to one of the passages that I read in this book. It wasn't written by Richard Foster, it was written by a mystic, but he quotes it, and this is what it says. Seek you first God's kingdom and his righteousness. What does this mean? What have I to do? Or what sort of effort is it that can be said to seek or pursue the kingdom of God? Shall I try to get a job suitable to my talents and powers in order thereby to exert an influence? No. Thou shalt seek first God's kingdom. Shall I then give all my fortune to the poor? No. Thou shalt first seek God's kingdom. Shall I go out to proclaim this teaching to the world? No. Thou shalt first seek God's kingdom. But then, in a certain sense, is it nothing I shall do? Yes, certainly. In a certain sense, it is nothing. Become nothing before God. Learn to keep silent. In this silence is the beginning, which is first to seek God's kingdom. I have been brought up in the Anglican Church, and I love the Anglican Church. I love all the Church of Christ, no matter what denomination they are. But in our own Anglican Church for many years, we had a form of service which was predictable, although the words were different and beautiful, and one could get so much from the words, both the hymns, the scriptures, the liturgy, and the talks. But it was sort of predictable. We would go in and sit down, and then the organist would play, and we would stand up, and all the choir would come along. And then when they sat down, we sat down. The hymn would be announced. We would all stand up and sing the hymn. We'd all sat down, and then the prayers would be said. And then we stand up and sing a psalm, at which time we would sit down again and listen to the Bible reading, when we all stood up and sang another psalm, and we all sat down, and then we all stood up and listened to another reading. And then we sat down to listen to the notices, and after the notices we all stood up and sang a hymn, whereby we stood down, and then the minister gave us the talk. At the end of the talk we all stood up and sang another hymn, the choir walked back, and there it was, we was all finished. May I add at this point too, the question about the organist playing at the end of the service. Now, it would be nice if some organists, I know, when we were left in a state of stillness, played something beautiful. But they practice a lot on some tremendous voluntaries. And so they decide to give us the very best right at the end of the service. But of course, we have got into the habit of taking that the first note he plays is the time for us all to get up and start talking, isn't it? So I would suggest sometimes, friends, that we sit there and listen to this man give of his best. And sometimes it will help our worship so much more. I just throw that in. Perhaps it's a thought. But you know, the point is that we was always on the go. From the start to the finish, we didn't have any silence. There was always someone speaking. And so you went in, and you came out, and I don't suppose we had more than a minute's silence, if that. Even in prayer meetings sometimes we were encouraged to keep it going, which meant, you know, don't let's have long periods of silence because everybody's getting worried. Or else we would start going around the circle, you know, and everybody had to pray. And of course, you're not thinking about the prayer they're praying, you're thinking about the prayer you're going to pray. And when you've said your prayer and they go around, you're thinking whether you said it well enough. I like Glenn Clark's story, you know, where he was sitting in one of those circles, and when it came to his turn, he said, pass. Did it? But the general Christian reaction to times of rest and quiet is I'm too busy. And if you talk about stillness or meditation, they say it's dangerous. Do you know, I'm sorry, friends, but it's sad that the church has got frightened of the word meditation. And yet it is one of the greatest things in the spiritual life. And those that would talk about the dangers of emptying our minds ought to talk about the dangers of filling our minds with too much wrong things. And the stress and the tension and the dangers they cause. And we ought to get back to the understanding that the mystics have of the greatness of meditation, what I call the missing link in the spiritual life. And so that very secret, because we consider it we're too busy or we consider it dangerous, the very secret stillness by which we may know God has become the missing link in church life and teaching, with much harm caused. And thank God he's drawing our attention to it again. And we had a beautiful meditation in the council ring yesterday morning, which you had the previous day, which drew us back to that great secret of stillness and quietness. Thomas Merton, listen to some of the men that talk about silence. Thomas Merton said, silence is the strength of the inner life. Emerson said, silence is a solvent that destroys personality and gives us leave to be great and universal. Henry Thomas Hamlin says, the true silence is the presence of God realized. The Quakers' strength, and still their strength, is in centering down into the stillness. And do you remember what I read about Starr Daily from Starr's letter? He said, Christ-centered, and may I emphasize that, Christ-centered meditation is most vital for unfolding the inner life and light. And then he adds those words, it is quite a discipline. Now, if this is so important, it would be well if we would learn the art of silence. We must learn how to shut off from our senses the impressions of the world outside. Remember, Jesus says, you are in the world, but not of this world. We must learn how to still those unruly thoughts and emotions that give us so much trouble. Have you ever realized how often we think emotionally only? And haven't you ever realized how much it's got you into trouble? We must learn how to listen to the still, small voice, as Elijah had to listen. I don't know whether you've ever been frustrated by hearing someone say, I heard God speak to me. And you wonder how God spoke to them, and you wonder why he doesn't speak to you in the same way. Sometimes you can be frustrated when some people say, God told me this and God said to me that. Well, I'm going to frustrate you a little bit more and I'll tell you how God spoke to me. I was visiting a family, again, that God had brought into my notice in an amazing sense of timing, which I won't tell you about this morning. But this family was in great need. A mother, husband who had just been pronounced incurable. She had a boy who had hemophilia, that blood disease or condition where if you break the blood vessels, the blood doesn't stop flowing. And another boy who had asthma, absolutely at the bottom of the pit when God drew me to them with an amazing sense of timing. But this boy, and many instantaneous healings were seen later with him. Sometimes we prayed, he had an instantaneous healing. Sometimes we prayed and he had to go to hospital. But one day he was in hospital. Now this young boy for 10 years had never had a holiday. He was always in and out of hospital and his schooling was ruined completely. And his mother had never been on holiday since he was born. So one day we was in hospital and I was talking with him and I said, Dave, I said, how would you like to go on a holiday? He said, I'd like to, Bert. I said, if you had the choice, where would you like to go? So he thought for a little while, and he said, I'd love to go to a farm. He loved animals. So I said, good. So when we left, we prayed about this, and we left it with the Lord. Some 3 weeks afterwards, and this is later on in life, 3 weeks after that, but I'm not talking about the same church now where we had no silence. I was in my church, and there we had a communion service. Now, that's when I did manage to get some silence in, because the service was held at the end of the ordinary service, and then we had communion. Those that didn't want to take communion went, but there was lots of people staying. And my practice was to get to the front of the church, go up first for communion, and then as all the others lined up to go, I would come back and get into the stillness and practice the presence of God. Not thinking, except being aware of my relationship to my Father. Not praying, not reading, but just enjoying sitting still with him. And so this 3 weeks after this request was made, I was sitting in the church absolutely still. And then, from deep within me, came a thought. Now, I wasn't listening for anything. I wasn't listening for voices. But there came a thought. And the thought was this: St. Julian's Farm. And I was so surprised. Now, I remembered that 2 years previously, I'd been to my first CFO camp. I didn't go the second year because I couldn't get up, but I'd sent other people. But I remembered that the secretary's address was Alice Smith and Norman Smith, and they'd both been to Winnipesaukee. Some time ago, when 20 English people came, they were here. They lived at St. Julian's Farm. So the next morning, being a Monday, I went to the office and phoned up Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith, I said, you may not remember me. My name's Bert Kerley. She said, I do remember you, Bert. I said, well, I've got a request. I got a young boy that hasn't had a holiday all his life, and he would like to have a holiday on his farm, and his mother hasn't had a holiday also. She said, well, send them down. I said, when? She said, any time you like. For how long? She said, as long as you like. And what would the cost be? Nothing. So we had them down there the next weekend. We got them driven down there, and they had a glorious holiday. But this is the interesting thing, friends, and it still thrills my soul. I had forgotten all about that young boy's holiday, but someone else hadn't, and that someone else is the Father who created the universe. He was concerned about a little boy's holiday on a farm, and all he wanted to do is to get me into a stillness so he could remind me that he'd got it organized. Isn't that love? That's why Jesus says, don't be anxious. Your Father knows what you have need of. Seek first the kingdom, and all the other things will be added unto you. I didn't start driving a motor car till late in life. I really had no desire, strangely enough. But there came a time, and this same family was the way it came about, really. The older boy, we managed to get into an engineering night school so that we can get him trained after his father had passed on in a very beautiful way. And he needed transport. So I said, well, let's pray for a motorcycle for you or something. So we prayed, and sure enough, we got a motorcycle. It was advertised for £5. And he was a mechanic. He loved mechanical things, and he could put it all in order. And so we got it, and he had this moped, it really was. And he came driving this round to me and says, "You have a go, Bert." Well, I wasn't mechanical, or I wasn't interested. I said, "Oh, no." He said, "Go and have a go." So I got on it, and I thought, "Oh, this is good. This is really good." Because before that, I'd been going around on a pedal cycle visiting people. And so I thought to myself, well, we prayed for one for him. I can pray for one for me. How not? And about 3 weeks later, I was visiting a dear old soul in the centre of London, someone Rosie and I had been looking after for some time. And this dear old soul, I was leaving the room after the end of the visit, and completely out of context, she said, "Bert, how would you like a motorcycle?" I said, "Well, I prayed for one a little while ago." I said, I'm sure we can get one. There's some on the board, you know, £10, £20. "Oh, no," she said. "If it's for God, it's got to be the best." So she said, "You get a brochure," she said, "and pick out the one that you want, and I'll buy it for you." Isn't that marvellous? So for the next 5 years, I went around on this bike, you see, doing me visiting. But there came one day, I was going down the road, and it was bitter cold. And it was getting very cold in the winter, but another thing was happening. We was receiving visitors from CFO and fellows, people from Africa and all over the place, and I was having to get friends to go out and meet them at the airports and then take them out for days, or if I wanted to take them anywhere, ask them to help me with the cars. And, you know, this was beginning to tick over in my mind, and then I was going down the road one day, and then I just thought, well, I didn't think, but the thought came to me, "Why don't you have a motor car, Bert?" And I said, "I'd love one, Lord." See? And you know, the next day a friend came up and says, "But how would you like to learn to drive?" I said, "That'd be a help because I'm going to have a motor car." And the next Sunday, friends, we were standing there, Rosie, Robin and Jill, my son and daughter, were standing round the fire, and we thought we heard someone at the door. And after a while, Rob says, "Wasn't that someone at the door, Dad?" I said, "Well, I thought so." So we went outside. No one was there, but an envelope was through the letterbox with £300 in, towards a car, it says. So I was learning how to drive. And then came the day for my driving test, and everybody thought, you know, Bert's prayers really are answered. It's a cert, he's going to pass. My youngsters told their workmates, and everybody at my firm thought, you know, it's going to pass, everything. Well, friends, I want to tell you, when I went to that test, you wouldn't believe what happened. The Fords have a habit of putting their first gear and reverse gear in the same place. All you have to do is press down on the lever. Well, my driving instructor said, "Let's go forward," and I went backwards. This is the examiner. And when he says, when I touch the top, you've got to give an emergency stop. I did an emergency stop. We had that skid, you thought we was on ice. And he said, "You're going a bit fast." I think he was a nervous wreck when he finished. And he had the cheek to say to me at the end, "I don't think you've reached the required standard." So, and I remember this when Bill was talking the other morning, when he talked, you know, the Lord says, "Rejoice in the Lord always," doesn't it? That's what the book said. And there was me, failed, and I've got to go back and tell my children and my work and everybody that I'd failed, didn't I? Rejoice in the Lord always. I'm rejoicing, Lord. It's miserable, but I'm rejoicing. But wonderfully enough, do you know what happened the next morning? A letter came from a friend with £250 towards a motor car. So I got enough now for a second-hand motor car, but I hadn't passed my test. However, we went out. A friend of mine at work says, Bert, he said, I know a man that's got a good car. I recommend it. You go and see it. So I said, right, I will do. I got enough now for a good second-hand car. So I asked a friend of mine to come round with me, and he was a mechanic and knew all about cars. So I said, would you come with me and have a look at this car? Yes, I'll be round tomorrow, Bert, he said. So that morning, before we went out, I got into my quiet time, my meditation time in the morning, and then I decided to get very still. After praying the prayer, Lord, this is your car. I want you to guide me. And then I got into one of those stillnesses again where I was listening and loving and just experiencing being a child of God. Absolutely still. And then a line of a CFO chorus came to me, just one line. Can you give me the CFO book, would you please? See if I can find the actual chorus. Just the one line. I hadn't been thinking about it. I hadn't been singing it. But here it came. Listen, friends. Very important. You remember this, you all know it. The second verse of Got Any Rivers. It says, got any dreams you think are impossible? Got any plans that you can't carry through? God is the power that makes all good possible. Now, I didn't have those come to me, but this is the line that came to me from deep within. Pray, love, and wait, and he'll bring the best to you. So what happened then was Peter came round, my friend, and we went to see this car, and it was a really nice car. Good recommendation. We went around, but there was on the windscreen just a slight scratch, and there were a few little touches of rust all round, and when we looked inside, there was a little slit on the upholstery. And I said to Pete, what do you think about it? He examined it, he said, it's a good car, Bert, well worth it. So I said, now tell me this, Pete. Would you think this is the best God could give me? And he stopped for a moment. He says, well, certainly not. So I turned round to the friend who was selling it. I said, well, I'm sorry, it's a nice car. I said, but it's not for me. And you know, by the time that I did pass my test, all the money had been given to me to buy a brand new Ford car. And I only asked God for a 4-door car and a good gearbox. I expected the wheels to come with it. But that's what I got. Beautiful. He'll bring the best to you. The other time was a time we were selling our house. We had found a bungalow. The kitchen in our old house was too small. Kids were growing up, and Rosie had seen a bungalow which she liked, and I liked immediately. We went around, and the lady said, well, lovely, we'll start proceedings. But you know, we had lots of people who wanted to buy our house. And so we put names down in order, and we started with the first one. Well, we went right through every person there, and in 6 months we couldn't sell our house. Went round to the friend and said, you better sell your house. We can't sell ours. They said, no, this is for you. But however, one day came when I had a phone call from the owners of the bungalow, and they said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Kerley, but they said, our house, a new house, has been built, and the builder wants the money now. So I'm afraid we got a pressure for a sale. So as I put the phone down, I thought, I must get in touch with my agent then and start getting him to really do something about it. And you know, and then I thought to myself, what am I doing? What am I doing? And I put the phone down. And so I went over to the church, this is in the middle of London, where I had got into the habit of having that 15 and 20 minutes practice of relaxing. And I went into the church. Now, God knew all about it. And I didn't have to tell him about it. And I didn't have to plead with him about it. But he knew I got a problem. And so I sat there again in the stillness. And after a while, the thought came up. Peter. Just Peter. And I'd remembered that at the beginning of the operations of selling our house, I had been to a church, and at the back of the church met a young man who had moved out of the district and wanted to move back, and his name was Peter. Now, I'd forgotten him because I had a lot of people lined up to buy the house, and as going through them one after the other, 6 months, I'd forgotten him. So I went back to the office straight away, phoned him up and said, Peter, do you still want to come back? He says, yes. So I said, do you want a new house or an old house? He said, an old house. I said, would you like to come and see mine? He said, I'll be down tonight. And he came that night. And I told him everything that was wrong with that house. This is how Christians do business with others, isn't it? I told him so many thoughts I was miserable at the finish. Then he said, I'll buy it. I said, I think you better tell your wife first. So he brought the wife back the next day, and they bought that house. But friends, again, you see, and youngsters, again, I want you to think seriously about this. What are we talking about? We're talking about God who is in you and around you, who knows you, understands you, wants to help you with all your problems, with all your joys. And he's so close. He was interested in that little boy's holiday. He was interested in supplying me with a car. He was interested in our house purchase. These are ordinary, everyday things. Isn't that wonderful? How much more we would learn of God if we would be still. How much more successful we would be. It's not a question of not having enough time. It makes the other time more successful. It makes sense to put time aside to go and be with God. How much more efficient. It pays. But there is more. As spiritual stillness is practiced, as we learn to sit in that stillness, so our Christ consciousness develops and we become more aware of the mind of Christ within us. And that's reflected in our daily life too. It does something deep within us which in time begins to surface. And we're able to listen to God even in the midst of noise. One of the joys last night to me, after I'd enjoyed that beautiful experience of dancing, was to sit back and see God's children so enjoying themselves. And it was really just as if God was in me, just enjoying the faces and enjoying the freedom and enjoying the happiness. It was a wonderful experience. Just as good as dancing, really. The practice of Christian meditation enables us to know God, to realize him, and to release him in us. If we have no time, no spaces for rest or reflection, for quietness, and just sitting peacefully, then we're too busy. We have a need to learn. And it starts with a desire, so don't feel guilty about it, will you? If we don't know what to do with ourselves when quietness comes, and we have to do something, then we really are seriously in need of learning the art of stillness. That's why Glenn Clark also introduced the horizontal hour in camps. He realized the need for us to assimilate and to rest. There are many secrets in the kingdom of heaven. Do you know, I love to read the teachings of Jesus and the stories of Jesus, but you know what excites me is when I read that he took his disciples away and taught them secrets. And I wanted to know what he was telling them. Starr Daily tells in his book Release a story. His wife was visiting in hospital a young woman who was in her final stages of cancer. And the tests also revealed that she was paralyzed from her waist down, and she only had 1 or 2 weeks to live. The story is, in the release, Starr went to his hammock in the backyard. He meditated for an hour. Suddenly he felt an unalterable sense of assurance. And he went into his house and he told his wife, "It has been done." She said, "What has been done?" "The woman with cancer. She has just been healed," Starr said. The patient was discharged to a rest home 2 weeks later, and the wife, in checking the exact time of her healing, found it as Starr stated. The recovery complete within 6 weeks. When I read that story, I was thrilled, but not by the story. The thing that interested me was, what did Starr Daily do for that hour? That's why I wrote to Starr Daily. That's what interested me. What was the secret of that stillness? When we consider how much time we give to the study of other things and consider now the possibilities of stillness, doesn't this encourage us to spend time in finding that missing link, to learn how to be still and know that I am God? Let's be still. Drop thy still dew of quietness till all our striving cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. In the name of Jesus, amen.